Welcome to the Middle-earth Philosopher, where I take a look at the universe of Middle-earth, its characters, subjects, peoples, and elements of their philosophies, and try to examine them from an in-universe point of view. The Silmarillion is one of my favorite books of all time, and reading through it, it was impossible for me not to notice that many of the animosities that take place in that universe happen because of prejudices that happen between the races where for one reason or another they don't like each other, even within the races themselves. So to begin with, I'm going to start with the Elves. In the movies and in the Silmarillion as well, Elves are depicted and treated by most of the other races as the definition of perfection. You don't hear about any physical deformities or natural diseases afflicting them. They age very slowly and then at some point seem to stop aging when they reach physical maturity. They move with a fluid grace and seem to have an inborn talent for magic as well. However, if you look at how other races saw them, it seems like these elements also gave them or made them vulnerable to a superiority complex as well, even among their own race. Before the count of ages in Middle-earth, the Elves were created and then were brought to the west of the world, known as Valinor, ruled by the Valar. Not all of them, however, chose to make that journey, with many choosing to remain in the east side of the world. Those who remained also had wisdom and physicality, but not near to the degree of the Elves who went west. This division is defined by two terms, the Eldar and the Morroquindi. The Eldar are the Elves who went west, and ever since become known as the High Elves, while the Morroquindi are referred to as the Dark Elves of Middle-earth because Elves were born in a time before the sun existed and the stars were still present. Plus, it's a reference, I believe, to just their lack of wisdom compared to their kin who went west. For a very long time, these two groups have no contact with each other whatsoever. But at around the time towards the middle or going towards the end of the First Age, one of the High Elf clans, the Noldor, returned back to Middle-earth to wage war on Morgoth, who was a renegade Valar and was already waging war with the Elves in Middle-earth. And it's the Noldor who start making these differences between their kin, who regard the Morroquindi as basically somewhat inferior to their own. Their physical beauty was not as great as those who had basked in the trees of Valinor. Their education was subpar compared to the education that they received from the Valar and the Maiar. And their civilization and technologies, with the exception of Doriath, seemed inferior to the Noldor when compared to their own. So therefore, some of the Noldor held themselves superior to the other elves in Middle-earth for these reasons. And not quite a few of those who did believe they were superior felt that these dark elves should also be subservient to them for those reasons as well. However, this prejudice was not one-sided in the least. The Elves of Middle-earth also held a prejudice against the Elves of Valinor. While they may have not been taught by divine spirits, they did possess a wisdom of Middle-earth in the nature and the lore that the High Elves did not have. And the fact that the Noldor seemed to disregard the superiority of knowledge greatly antagonized some of the Sindar Elves who were living there. And thus, what happens when someone disrespects you in your own house? You disrespect them back. However, at the same time, many of the Sindar Elves also regarded the High Elves as intruders and a foreshadowing of doom upon their culture because of the change they brought with them. Even though they were already at war with Morgoth before the Noldor arrived, their arrival was marked with the arrival of the sun, which ended the eternal night that Middle-earth had been under for countless ages. Therefore, many of the Elves held the Noldor responsible for bringing upon them this catastrophe. The Silmarillion has a couple of characters that best express this view, the first one being Eol, and the second being High King Thingol of the Sindar. However, if these animosities existed between the Elves themselves, then they definitely existed with how they related to some of the other races in the First Age. The Dwarves in particular were not well liked. Encountered long before humans and initially by the Dark Elves themselves, they were regarded as not beautiful to look at, too short, and their language being ugly and sloppy. This view was shared by the High Elves as well, and this view was maintained even though it was discovered that they were intelligent, had their own culture, and were arguably the better warriors of Middle-earth. their warlike nature making them stubborn, and their weapons and craftsmanship regarded second only to the High Elves themselves, and even then, not by very much. This was put nowhere better on display than during the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, where during this final battle between the Beleriand Alliance and Morgoth's forces, the Dwarves were the only ones who were able to hold their own and not only withstand the dragonfire of Morgoth's dragon Glaurung, but also defeat him as well, allowing for themselves and the rest of the Elves to escape as well. These were qualities that the Elves, both of the Sindar and of the Noldor, grudgingly acknowledged, and therefore they made alliances with them. However, much of that alliance was not out of mutual respect, rather than mutual need, with the Elves still referring to the Dwarves as the quote-unquote stunted people. And even though during the Second Age, some of this did improve, with the Dwarves of Khazad-dûm and the Noldor who still remained, forming a friendship there, the rest of the Elven kingdoms still mistrusted the Dwarves, and vice versa. As far as the Orc goes, that's pretty much simple and more or less goes without saying. The Elves hated the Orcs. Being corrupted and given to Morgoth's hate of all things not of his own making, Orcs are always hostile towards their pure-blooded kin, and the Elves see this as such a horrible abomination that they kill all Orcs on sight. They often fuse this with a black and white view of good and evil, and it's truthfully not that hard to do so. However, there is also no hiding the spite of which they hold the Orcs in, and that they were just naturally inclined to evil just made it easier to do so. The Elves' hatred of Orcs is second only to the Dwarves themselves, which I'll get into later. But perhaps the most interesting and more nuanced of the relationships with other races is with the humans, and this was a mixed reaction. While being similar in appearance and intelligence, their mortality, as I've stated in other videos, was regarded as strange and abnormal. Their perspectives of time and space was entirely different, as the lifetimes of a human was equivalent about of a month or a year to an immortal elf. Humans also seemed more corruptible in their morality, though by now, the Elves had well established that they could just as easily be corrupted as well. Humans, though, were easier to turn, and were easier to become afraid as well. Interestingly enough, the Elves who didn't like humans had a whole number of slurs that they used for them. The inscrutable, the night-fearers, the heavy-handed, the unhappy, and the base-born. All of these speak of how alien humanity seemed to the Elves, and many looked down upon them because of it. They seemed to find no balance or rest in the world. That being said though, most of the Elves still seemed to respect humans, even if they did not understand them, and they were often given much more grace than the Dwarves. In the Second Age, even though slurs were not used as much by Elves towards humans, there was still a divide between them in terms of their own existence. However, just like in the First Age, this did not stop them from making alliances with the humans, in particular the Númenóreans. However, because of what happened with Númenor, by and large, and it seems like unless they had to, many Elves kept their distance from humans. And it was very rare for a human ever to see an elf in person, unless it was during perhaps wartime. So I guess you can say that in a way, any animosity and issues the Elves had with other peoples was more rooted in their aloofness than anything else. And this brings me to my second favorite peoples of Middle-earth, the Dwarves. I want to start out by saying that I love the Dwarves. I love their culture, I love their attitude, I love how independent they are and how they take no bullshit from anybody. That being said though, obviously they had their own issues as well. Dwarven animosity is different from those of other races because much of it seems to stem from an inferiority complex. Dwarven culture is advanced, if not more advanced than any other civilization east of Valinor. Their structures are mammoth in scale, and their weapons, like I said before, are top quality, and were feared in war, and respected by all other races. And it's no small irony that these accomplishments and feats are done by people who were considered not that much taller than hobbits. But what they lacked in height, they made up for in strength and determination. Both Morgoth and Sauron have great difficulty handling the race, and Morgoth never once assaults their strongholds during the First Age. And Sauron himself is not able to corrupt them as he was with the humans. So, with all these accolades, you would think that the Dwarves would have nothing to prove. And yet, many times they behave as if they do. The Dwarves' animosity is mostly directed at the Elves as a whole. Ever since their first meeting during the First Age, there seems to have been an animosity between the both of them in regards to how they both were made. While the Elves regarded them as ugly and unappealing, the Dwarves regarded the Elves as being snobbish pretty boys who put down their own culture. Moreover, the Dwarves were already very secretive about their own culture anyways, not teaching any of its workings to most of the people that they encountered. In the history between the two races, only 2 Elves seem to have learned anything about the language, which, like the race themselves, is difficult to understand. During the First Age, Dwarves traded with Elves and allied themselves with them only in times of war against the Orcs. But as the Noldor are defeated, this alliance falls apart, culminating in the fall of the Elven kingdom of Doriath after Dwarven craftsmen kill King Thingol for one of the Silmarils. During the Second Age, this somewhat improves with the relations of the Dwarves of Khazad-dûm with the Noldor Elves living in Eregion. They also fight against Sauron and are part of the last alliance in that era's last conclusive battle. Yet despite these alliances, many of the other races still don't like the Dwarves or seem to mistrust them. By the time of the Third Age, rather than being considered ugly and stunted, they seem to be now more or less seen as being greedy and self-centered, which I guess you could say is a small improvement, but still. And for me personally, I find no better portrayal of this animosity between the Dwarves and the Elves than during The Hobbit, The Battle of Five Armies. And while yes, I know a lot of people don't like those movies, there are those that do, and I happen to be one of them, so there you are. That being said though, in the movies, though not in the books, there's a violent skirmish that happens between the Elves and the Dwarves before the actual battle with the Orcs begins. And while many people had a problem with this because the books didn't mention this, at the same time, the Silmarillion does detail that there were wars between the Elves and the Dwarves. So that the movie portrayed such a violent skirmish in the Third Age, while being not in the books, is also not unheard of and not unprecedented as well. When it comes to humans, as far as I can tell, the Dwarves only had a long-standing grudge with the people of Rohan for an insult that was made to one of their ancient kings. Even though it's said that they killed him for the insult, it is still remembered by the Dwarves long afterwards. All that said though, the Dwarves don't hate anyone as much as they do the Orcs. And while it's true that none of the other races of Middle-earth liked them, the Dwarves had a long-standing fury that was taken to extremes, even for Middle-earth. In the Third Age, the exiled King Thror was murdered at the doors of the now fallen Khazad-dûm by the resident Orcs there. They defiled his body and sent his companion in shamed. So enraged were the rest of the Dwarves that all the clans from all over Middle-earth gathered at the Misty Mountains and literally hunted them down to near extinction. This is considered to be the one and only reference where two races deliberately intended to not just defeat each other, but wipe them off the face of the earth, literally. And it was said that after this war, not one orc remained in the Misty Mountains for a very, very long time. This war not only shows just how extreme Dwarven hatred can go in and of itself, but also out of all the other races in Middle-earth, because they are the only race that literally attempted to commit genocide. The bottom line essentially was that when it comes to Dwarven prejudice and animosity, it generally comes from how much you disrespect them and the severity of the insult that you gave them, perceived or not. The Dwarves are the Napoleons of Middle-earth. They will not tolerate anyone putting down their culture and will hold that grievance for long years afterwards if anyone does so. Whether they're orcs, humans, or elves, it does not matter. When it comes to humans, as one might expect, their animosity is much more nuanced than the other races. In the Silmarillion, there are no stories of any prejudice towards elves or dwarves. Misunderstandings, yes, but nothing so shallow as race. The Haladin, a subculture of the humans living during the First Age, comes closest by being very reclusive and exclusionist of other peoples, including other human tribes as well, preferring to be left alone and going to great lengths to do so. It is during the Second Age that human animosity and prejudice really comes to the fore. The Númenóreans are considered to have been the most advanced race of humanity that has ever existed in Middle-earth, and that by itself can spark certain attitudes. But initially, their use of superior knowledge was to aid in the rebuilding of the world and teach other peoples to improve their own lives. Yet, despite this, they still segregated themselves from those who they called middlemen, human tribes that still lived in Middle-earth, while the Númenóreans lived on an island out in the sea. And as everyone knows, The Númenóreans were known for being taller, stronger, and smarter than most of the other races in the world at that time. But for a while, there was no malice intent in that. However, as their desire for immortality increases, this begins to change, and it leads to an envy of the Eldar, the only other race in Middle-earth who could be considered an equal to or superior to the Númenóreans. Envy soon devolves into bitterness and jealousy, and the race grows to despise the Elves as reminders of what they want but cannot have. And it is this state of hate that Sauron finds them in when he arrives in Númenor as their captain, since no one can withstand them in war. The jealousy made it easier for them to corrupt. And again, as everyone knows, this results in the destruction of Númenor and the near extinction of the Númenórean race. This extreme lesson makes the survivors, now calling themselves the Dúnedain, more determined to preserve their race more than ever. The southern kingdom of Gondor takes this the most seriously, as it was tradition for them to not marry those that they considered of a lesser race, especially the nobility and the king. This was driven by both racial pride and fear that by intermarrying, they would defile themselves and become lesser as well. This prejudice eventually causes a civil war when one of the kings, Valakar, decides to marry outside their own race anyway. Many of the high-born nobles of Gondor vehemently oppose this and start a war. By the end of the conflict, the rightful king, Valakar's son, Ullakar, is restored to the throne, and many of the fears that the king's line would diminish prove initially false. But so many of the people are killed during that war, it ended up doing more damage to their race than any intermarriage ever could. Over time, many of them do intermarry anyway. Whether this was out of necessity or love, I can't say. As a result, though, the lifespan does start to grow shorter, though this was also attributed to the gift of long life being slowly withdrawn from the race of humanity as a whole as well. Though humans have fought mostly amongst themselves during the Third Age, most of this was due to political allegiance rather than racial status. So this included the Balkoth, the Haradrim, and the Easterlings, who hated Gondor because of their allegiance to Sauron, rather than it was because they were Gondorians, or descendants of Númenor. I find these negative elements interesting in the world of Middle-earth because it's often viewed as kind of a simplistic tale. And yet, when you read the Silmarillion and some of the other books as well, and even the movies tend to hint at this, you get a glimmer of that there's more going on than meets the eye. And while there is still a sense of good and evil in this universe, it is also at the same time not without its elements of gray. As I said before, the Elves are often presented as the pinnacle of perfection in Middle-earth, and yet they have so many issues within their own culture that it's almost embarrassing to discuss. And this division and discord among the Elves themselves was very well known to everyone else as well, so it was not like this was a well-kept secret. And yet, despite these elements, there are still times where these people can come together for a common cause or for a common reason, with some even overcoming the natural animosities that they have towards each other in their own communities. And that's what I discovered among these animosities between the peoples of Middle-earth and the Silmarillion.